very rarely do I get to sit down with an author of a book that I've read for, even though it's going to be 20 minutes. So I got questions for you. Just a reminder, if you weren't here last night, if you go to the next slide, or do I have the, next slide. There's a QR code that you can write in questions for all the speakers. And tonight at the Underground Sessions, we're going to use that as the basis for asking questions. So if you have questions for Paul, take out your phone, scan that right now, send in the questions. Maybe even as I'm interviewing him, it'll spark some ideas in your mind. But I got questions for you right now, Paul.
All right,
so
let's do it.
First of all, the first question I have, a philosophy question. What is a Chick-fil-A sandwich?
Isn't that just like Jesus or something? I don't know. It's always the right answer. Where's Rachel, right? Jesus. Yeah.
There you go. Well, anyway, so this book, Cultural Apologetics, I came across it because I think I saw a post from my philosophy professor from seminary, Doug Groteis, said he was actually teaching out of this, his class. And I had been looking for a book like this for a few years that was doing kind of what you did, this argument for beauty and things like that. My question is, were you the trendsetter? Or were you kind of at the front end of this, or how did this book come about?
It is. That's actually a great question. I'm glad you asked it.
That's what I do. I ask good questions.
Good job.
I'm told I ask good questions.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, then this will be fun. So, it's interesting. The phrase cultural apologetic started coming onto my radar around 2012, 2013, right about the time when I started teaching at a seminary in Texas. And we were developing a curriculum for a master's in apologetics. I'm like, hey, we should have a class on cultural apologetics. And so we added the class, and because it was my idea, I was assigned the class. And so I did what any educator would do at that time. This was about 2013. I Googled, what is cultural apologetics?
Yes.
So I'm like, what am I going to teach on here?
Well, can I just qualify this too?
Yeah.
So when I look at programs nowadays, everybody's got a class on cultural. Okay, all right, good, we're getting there.
Yeah, it wasn't there. So I Googled it, and there are like 2 or 3, things that came up, and things like, showing the relevancy of Jesus or showing the desirability of Jesus, and I like those, but there's basically nothing. And so what I did that first time I taught that class, Cultural Apologetics, was I just picked 7 books that I wanted to read, right, on culture, the gospel, and apologetics, and we just used it as like a research seminar. And I did that the first time, and then the next year I swapped it out with 7 different books, and then the third time I did it, I swapped it out with 7 different books. And by that third time, I think I began to develop my own view of what I'm thinking of cultural apologetics is, and that was like the definition I'll offer in the book that's basically what we shared today. And so in some way, and then the publisher made me title the book Cultural Apologetics, because that's supposed to be good for sales.
Is that what,
and so
what
in some ways
do,
it became like a lane on its, and I actually claimed a lane for it, so I claim it as its own lane. But yeah, but the encouraging thing is, while I'm not the only one that writes and talks in these areas, it has become, it is something that's on people's radar right now, because I think we realize that we need to do the rational stuff, but we're more than just brains on a stick, right? We're embodied humans, and we need to value that. And so my idea was, I want to free us to use all the resources that we have in making a case for the brilliance and beauty of the gospel. Yeah. And that's kind of what the book is.
Well, and you do it really brilliantly. I loved the different paradigms you have in here. I know you said you stole it from the other guy, but you have a way of bringing it down to earth when I've heard you talk. I was asking TZ about this last night. We live in such a culture that's based on image and story and emotion, that I think what you're doing here is really important for getting at people's hearts. But you also talk a little bit about kind of this anti-intellectual stream. And part of that, I think, is connected with that we react emotionally, we think emotionally, and we don't learn to use our mind. Do you see that too? And what are some ways you think we can combat that?
Yes, I see that, and that's part of that's a big motivation for writing books like this.
Okay.
Is that, and even specifically drawing attention to the problem of anti-intellectualism. It's a huge problem. So maybe you guys, maybe you don't know this, but so in 1996, Mark Knoll, who's a historian, wrote this book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And in that book, the very first sentence is this. It's going to hurt. He says, the scandal of the evangelical mind is that there is no evangelical mind, right? That's kind of painful. Things have progressed since then in the academy. There's an amazing renaissance of Christian thought that's taking place in the academy. Even in my own discipline of philosophy, the atheists are noticing, and they're scared in some ways, because there's a huge renaissance of Christian philosophy that's really exciting. And in some ways, my prayer is that God would use this as a beachhead to the academy, but to the culture at large. But yes, it is a problem, and it's something and how can we address it? Well, I mean, calling it out, naming it, and then just realizing that what it means to be apprentice. So it involves viewing Jesus as within new categories. So, for example, we tend to give Jesus moral or spiritual authority in our lives, but we don't always give him intellectual authority in our lives, right? We think we're supposed to go to the men and women with the lab coats, the white lab coats for that. But as Dallas Willard told us, Jesus is smart. In fact, he's the smartest person ever. And so we have to see Jesus as someone who has intellectual virtue, and then we need to follow in his footsteps and become like him. So it's a whole life, but yeah.
Well, no, it's good. So we've run the Greg Kokel's tactics class here a couple times, and inevitably in that class, we get to a place where, ask questions, ask people questions, leading questions to get you to eventually get into understand what people believe. But I think people get scared where they eventually get to a place where, well, now I need to know something. Okay. And people are reticent to actually do the work of knowing the things to answer the questions that people are asking. So I think you're kind of tapping into that. So I'm not quite sure how to ask this question, but I wanted to bring it up because at the end of the book, you kind of, I don't want to say you took on, but you addressed the Rod Dreher, the Benedict option. And I've heard people talk recently about how we need a kind of a new model for engaging the culture. And let me summarize this really quickly. I've read a few articles about how the way Christianity is seen culturally, pre-like 1990s, very positive. If you wanted to be a Christian in culture, you probably know this. 1994 to 2014, the 90s and the aughts, neutral, right? So we're winsomely engaging. Well, now we live in this phrase I hear is negative world, where it's openly hostile. And we need a kind of a new way of engaging that. Can you guide us there? Have you? And I see the one person I was hearing in the interview was pointing to Rod Dreher, the Benedict option, as an option of doing that, where we just basically withdraw from the culture and we've lost. We need to redisciple people. Yeah. Do you think this is a new model to help us with that?
I hope so. Let's see. Yeah. So I'm aware.
You get what I'm asking. I know it's not a clear formulated question.
Yeah, because I'm aware of the discussion going on with the negative culture. There's a little debate about, which is kind of a little interesting to me. Should we be winsome, in our evangelism or not, and in our personhood, in our interactions with others? And I think the answer biblically is very clear that we ought to be. We should be. I think of even the well-known, often quoted passage on apologetics in 1 Peter 3:15. Not only does it say, always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that you have within, but the next or last part of that verse says, but do this with gentleness and respect. And that's two-part, both respect about whom we're speaking, the Lord, but respect and gentleness to whom we're speaking as Christian, as people, humans. And so I do think that, there are pockets that are negative and there are pockets that are not. Culture is not monolithic, right? That's something that's problematic with the categorization that you gave, which I know isn't yours. Culture is not monolithic, and so it requires wisdom. So actually, to me, the thing that is the dearth of is Christian wisdom, and that's a broader conversation about the role of virtue in the Christian life, right? The ancients had a picture of what it meant to flourish as humans in culture, and it was a sevenfold picture, very detailed. And it was the four classic virtues, courage, I'll give them in order, because there's a logical connection. Wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. These are the classic virtues of the Greeks, and then the church just added the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. And that's the sevenfold picture of what human flourishing and how we ought to interact with the world. And the virtue approach is very different than the, should we be mean or not mean? Should we be harsh or winsome? To me, it's a very different paradigm. So, I think that, I don't know if it's a new model, but it's, at least I'm hoping that kind of stuff comes out.
Yeah. Well, at least it's in part of that discussion about how should we confront the ideas that are out there.
Yes.
Do it with gentleness and respect, but how do we... Because I think a lot of people feel like the battle has been brought to us. That's why that conversation is happening.
And that's where wisdom,
how do we engage?
And that's where wisdom engages, because it's not an all or nothing, right? Sometimes it's harsh and forceful, like Jesus clearing the temples, but other times it's kind and compassion, and winsome in that way. So I think that's where the wisdom is the key to me, at least on that.
So getting to the cultural idea. The categories used, the Christian voice is muted, the Christian conscience is muted, the Christian imagination is muted. How did we get to this muted place? What led here? It isn't important to understand that.
Okay, good. it is important to understand that so that we don't repeat it. And how do we get there is a longer tale, some of which I do in the book. There's a tale that you could give through...
Buy the book.
Yeah, chapter 2. There's a tale that you can give through intellectual history,
Yeah.
and there are some key moves. As a philosopher, I can identify them, key moves, that actually began in late medieval scholastic philosophy and theology. But it would be, for example, well, I don't even know if I want to do that, but there's some idea shifts that I can talk about if you'd like. But there's also like a spiritual way to understand this too, and in many ways I just think of this as Romans 1, right? So it begins with the suppression of the knowledge of God, and from there, as even N.T. Wright, in his commentary on Romans 1, he says, when we suppress the truth about God, it all goes downhill from there, right? C.S. Lewis says at that moment the world is turned upside down. And so you could give this kind of spiritual gloss. From that moment on, there's been a kind of emptying of the world of its transcendence or its magic. Yeah. And so sociologists and historians and philosophers have talked about the disenchanting of the world. And that's a kind of emptying of the world. So one last thing I'll say, if you go back to 500 years ago, everyone thought that the world was enchanted. Everyone thought that the world was a sacrament and that earthly realities point to heavenly realities. And so notice, given that view of reality, unbelief is really hard. In a disenchanted age, it's flipped. Belief is difficult for us as Christians, and unbelief is possible. And that's the big shift. And there's a lot, and I could point you guys to tons of stuff, but do a little of that here as well.
So for the last part here, let's kind of get a little street level.
Okay.
Who are the pop philosophers in American culture that we should pay attention to right now? That we can quote, like Paul. Like, who should we be quoting to other people?
Yeah. Anybody? I mean, I don't know. Anyone that...
I don't know if you had some tangible examples you've seen.
Of Christian apologists or just people in the
culture?
Well,
no, you were saying, is there
Gotcha.
a movie, a song that is a natural, what's the practical, how do we bridge the gap?
Okay, good. Love it.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, I think that the one thing I love... thinking about the gospel as a three-part story of tragedy, comedy, and fairy story. This is Frederick Buechner. He wrote a book, Telling the Truth. It's in there. And I think that's a great way to think of the gospel. And what we're drawn to in the stories of culture and the movies that we watch, I think that the good ones, we're drawn to them because they reveal one or more of those aspects of the gospel story. Mm-hmm. And so in many ways, you can pull from almost any good story and you can make connections to the gospel. And you can do that with musicians, and you can do that with authors, right? I would say if you're looking to read authors that can help re-enchant our world, I would point you to a little more difficult to read authors, but Marilyn Robinson, Wendell Berry, Flannery O'Connor. Mm-hmm. One of my new favorites, actually two new favorites, is William Kent Kruger. Wrote books like This Tender Land, which is a mashup of Homer's Odyssey and Huck Finn, but it's just enchanting, right? It helps us see the world in fresh eyes. So there are authors that we can read even today that would help us too. So It's everywhere.
You mentioned Pearl Jam.
Yes.
I remember it too.
Good man.
Not that I went to a concert, but
Yeah.
What's your favorite movie?
Oh gosh.
Do you have a favorite movie to use for this?
For this? Oh gosh. Can I give you just a genre?
Okay,
great. Because it's hard to do favorite. I want to say sci-fi and
give me a couple examples.
Okay,
in
sci-fi
the genre,
and close behind that dystopian, because both of those genres ask two questions that I think are really profound. What does it mean to be human? And so examples, I love Battlestar Galactica, and so many, but that's probably my top. And then dystopian for the same reason. How do we flourish in a disenchanted world, a dystopian world? And what is our fascination with dystopians actually teach us about our longing for a better world? And there's so many,
Okay, well, so you sparked something in my mind with that. So can I take a right hand?
Of course.
What does it mean to be human?
Yeah.
I think that's a question we have to grapple with. The church has never had to do before. Mm-hmm. With artificial intelligence and some of the things that's coming down the pike. Yeah. How should we do that? What are some things, I'll give you an example. So I heard an interview with a guy who used to be the head of Google, and he was giving an example of this. If you're a parent here, coming down the road, there might be a time where we actually create a doll that's going to be able to interact with your kid and be their friend.
Yeah.
And then you have to teach your kid, what does it mean to be a human being? And that's not what are the metaphysical questions related to that? And how would you encourage parents in that realm.
Oh, gosh, it's so
That's something people aren't thinking about, but it's coming.
Yeah, this sounds like a self-plug, but it's so important that my current season that will be released in the spring of my podcast called the Eudo Podcast, EUDO, you can find it anywhere, will be on this very question. Human flourishing in a disenchanted world. And the question we're addressing is, what does it mean to be human? Because to me, in many ways, that is the battle line. I mean, there's other battle lines, but that is one key battle line. AI is just one example among others, right, where that's a key battle line. And so, I think we need to think biblically about this. And so the Imago Dei language is important, right? The image of God language is really important. Love to talk about that. I think we need to think philosophically about humans. And for me, there's this, just to summarize, my view, and I do teach on this, I teach metaphysics, the structure and nature of reality, including the question of human person. I think we are souls that have bodies, so I'm essentially a soul that has a body, and they're tightly integrated. Yeah. And so our bodies are really, really important, and so we don't minimize that, but we can exist without it, right? That's why we're a soul with a body. So there's a long story there. And then I think we need to incorporate and be able to say something about the science that we're being told, and this question of, can AI create art, and can AI write good essays, which evidently they can.
I just was having a conversation with we did a graphic for our Ecclesiastes series, and I think he used some of the AI stuff for that, which
crazy.
My communications guy was really upset about that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna connect you guys. You guys can argue.
Yep.
So, anyway, maybe to wrap this up, I think I know it's early on a Saturday morning to talk about philosophy, but the reality is, and you said this at the beginning, everybody is a philosopher, and it's just a matter of whether they're a good or a bad philosopher. So, 3 points on how we can be good philosophers to kind of sum this up, and hopefully we'll get some good philosophy questions tonight.
View Jesus as someone who has intellectual virtue and worthy of following in that area. So look to him and not the scientists first, right, for knowledge. Religious claims are knowledge claims. And then to cultivate the life of the mind. And that would include reading, read broadly. I read broadly and I read specifically. I read and teach in philosophy, but I read broadly because I want to be aware of things and learn. So cultivate the love of learning, cultivate the life of the mind, and follow exemplars, people that you can follow that are trusted. And one last plug, Dallas Willard has, I think, helped us all a lot. And so recently was rereading The Renovation of the Soul, which is one of his books on spiritual formation that addresses directly the question, what does it mean to be human? And it also addresses the question of what does it mean to love God with all of our being, including our minds, in a really attractive way. So maybe that would be a good, if you want a book to start with. Dallas Willard and maybe J.P. Moreland, Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, or all of your mind.
All your mind,
that one.
Great. Awesome. Hey, Paul Gould, thank you so much. Brilliant talk.